Welcome. My name is Dr. Nathalie Edmond, and I'm excited to spend some time with you talking about how trauma of racism lives in our bodies. So thinking about how trauma lives in our bodies is complicated because we spend so much of our life living in our heads and making decisions from our heads, kind of neglecting what our body is telling us. So my consultation company, as a psychologist and anti-racism consultant and yoga teacher, is really about being revolutionary. Revolutionary in terms of learning how we can live our best lives, how the collective can live their best lives. And when I mean best lives, I mean thriving, not just surviving. That it is revolutionary for some bodies to rest. It is revolutionary for some bodies to have enough resources in order to thrive. It is revolutionary to think about, particularly when you live in a brown or Black body, how the world doesn't have as much ease for you. And that just happens based on skin pigmentation. We're not even mentioning all the other intersecting identities like queerness or neurodiversity or disabilities or mental health struggles or being undocumented, all the ways in which that also causes stress in the body. So as a trauma therapist who's trained in somatic approaches, I think about how do we begin to notice what's happening in our bodies. So I invite you to even just take a few moments to check in with yourself. Maybe starting at the crown of your head and just pausing, noticing the sounds around you. Noticing the temperature in the room. And just starting to move your awareness down from the crown of the head to notice what's happening in your face. Where is there ease? Where is there tension? Noticing if there's any tension in the space in between the eyebrows, the jaw, the neck. And feeling free to allow movement to come into your body. So maybe as you get to the neck, you do some half neck rolls or full neck rolls. Maybe you decide to just let your left ear go to your left shoulder. Allow your right shoulder to draw away. And just creating some spaciousness in that side of the body. Maybe after a little bit of time, maybe you draw that right ear to the right shoulder. Allowing the left shoulder to relax a bit. And slowly drawing the head back to center, maybe deciding to put some shoulder rolls, some slow rolls up and back and down and forward a couple of times in one direction, a couple of times in the other direction. And just noticing that tension or that ease or the way that your body crackles. And as you maybe let go of those shoulder rolls, maybe drawing the chest forward and back. Starting to move forward and back. kind of like the seated cat-cow. And maybe feeling how delicious that is, or pain. Maybe moving side to side. Maybe allowing the arms to lift and the wrists to roll. And maybe making sure to get the other direction as well, letting the fingers move around, letting those fluids move in the body. And maybe you have a desire to get up for a bit, maybe pausing this, do a little bit of stretching, or maybe staying seated, lifting the hands up, maybe right hand to the left wrist, and maybe a little side stretch. Inhale, lifting up, left hand to right wrist, lift it up, and then side bend. And release. Maybe interlace the fingers behind and draw the chest up. And just noticing how having that stretching, maybe that creates a little bit more expansiveness. Maybe you're a little bit more alert. Maybe you're like, ooh, I'm really tired and I need to go rest. What would it mean? Would it be revolutionary for you to tune in more to your body, to your nervous system? Let's talk a little bit about nervous system. So this image kind of tracks our nervous system. We have this autonomic nervous system that goes into a sympathetic and parasympathetic response. We go into a sympathetic response when we are stressed. And we go into a parasympathetic response, our relaxation response. I love this hand model that I learned from the triune brain. And basically, this Dan Siegel that I've learned it the most from, kind of one of these interpersonal neurobiologists. And he does this, the hand model. And if you look at like the profile of that, it's very much the way the profile of the head would be. And so the way that I've learned the triune model is that we have 3 parts to our brain and it's connected to our nervous system. And that's the information that our body is getting from the environment. So the arm is our spinal cord. And right here at the wrist is our reptilian brain. And that is the most primitive part of the brain that we share with the animal kingdom. That part of the brain that's the somatic part, right? That's the part that's our respiration, sweating, our heartbeat. That's really the instinctual part of the brain. When we think about the ways in which we defend ourselves, when we think we're in danger, that comes from this part of the brain. And then if we think about the wrist, the part of the hand, or the palm and the part of the hand, we think about that as the limbic system, or the mammalian part of the brain, and that's the part of the brain that holds our emotional memory system. That's connected to the amygdala, which is our alarm system. And our alarm system is constantly scanning the environment for potential danger. That danger can be anything that's novel, that's different, that we've been kind of conditioned to fear in the past. And the way that the amygdala works, it's meant to be speedy. It's meant to be quick. So it kind of has a negativity bias that assumes the worst. It assumes danger. So if we're walking and we see a stick, we might mistake the stick for a snake because that increases our chances of survival. When we look at the fingers, that is our frontal cortex or prefrontal cortex, and that's the most sophisticated part of the brain that doesn't fully develop until our mid-20s. So what is this frontal cortex? That is the executive functioning part of our brain. That's when we talk about having a mindfulness muscle, when we talk about dual awareness, when we talk about impulse control, being able to long-term plan, being able to see what the potential consequences of our actions are. All of that is frontal cortex. So in a well-integrated brain, we have them all connected. And they're in harmony and they're working together. And the amygdala is scanning the environment for danger. And when the environment notices that danger, we flip our lid. And when we flip our lid, that frontal cortex goes offline. So all those skills, compassion, gratitude, mindfulness, dual awareness, long-term problem solving, all of that is not available to us, right? That the reality is that the frontal cortex doesn't do well at intense levels of emotion. So this amygdala, right, communicates to the lizard part of our brain or the reptilian part of our brain to, to shut down everything that's not absolutely necessary for survival. We don't want to waste energy if we're trying to survive. So that's why the frontal cortex go offline. And we start to experience perhaps like blood flowing through the extremities from the heartbeat racing, right? And thinking about blood flowing through the extremities, right, is that we can run, we can fight, and if things get too overwhelmed, we can shut down into a dorsal vagal response, which is just like conserving energy. And, the sympathetic response is the heartbeat racing, us getting ready to fight or flight. The parasympathetic response is when the danger is done, we go back to regular operating system. The thing about that sympathetic response is there's certain parts of the body we don't need to access, right? We said we don't need to access that frontal cortex, but we also don't need to access rest or digest, right? And so if we think about that, right, it's why should I be able to sleep if I'm super stressed? Why should I be able to digest if my life is in danger? And we can't access that stuff. So that's a normal part of functioning, right? Sympathetic response, parasympathetic response, it's just a daily life. But some of us have experiences where we experience stress or trauma. Trauma is anything that overwhelms our body and our mind's ability to integrate that information, right? It's frightening, it's terrifying, it creates an overload in our system, and our body and our nervous system and our brain have these amazing ways to try to cope with things that are unimaginable and things that break our spirit. So when we think about the stress response, going back to my little graphic, right, is that our window of tolerance is our optimal level of arousal. So when we think about that window of tolerance, right, that's where we can learn, we can engage with people, we can feel our emotions, we can express our emotions, we have the capacity for compassion, capacity for gratitude, and we have ability to be fluid, flexible. We're really engaged, and it's in this place of window of tolerance is just a sense of connection and of safety. And we each have a stress response, right? And when that amygdala fires, saying danger, danger, we move into a sympathetic response, that's hyperarousal, right? Which is often fight or flight, because we're engaged, we're ready to do something. We're either ready to flee physically or mentally, or we're ready to fight, and we're in some sort of aggression. And there are a lot of ways that this can show up, right? That some people's version of flight is emotionally eating or using substances, self-harming. Some people it's physically fighting, it's verbally fighting, it's being really critical. And I think about perfectionism and the energy that comes into doing, or worrying, doing. These are sympathetic hyperarousal responses. Does that sound familiar to anyone? When we think about, a little bit of a sympathetic response is helpful, right? It can drive us into action, but too much can leave us scattered and never being able to rest, never being able to slow down, going from one project to the next to the next. And that feels different in our bodies. When I think about, the system getting so overwhelmed, that we go into dorsal vagal response, right? That's that hypoarousal where we're really shut down. We can be numb, disconnected, like little energy, depressed, ashamed, have these out-of-body experiences. Our heart rate slows down so much, our breathing is so shallow. And thinking about all of these stress responses, they're healthy. The problem is when we spend too much time in these stress responses that our body doesn't have a time to restore itself. So I invite you to be mindful throughout the day. Is when are you in your optimal window of tolerance? When are you more in that sympathetic hyper-aroused, where you're fight or flight? And when are you in more of this shutdown, freeze or fawn type response? And to know, thinking about when we think about our nervous system, and that's how I like to think about myself, is in terms of my nervous system, right? Is how is my nervous system reacting to this conversation, to this email, to this social media post, to this exam I'm about to take? That when we think about our nervous system, is that some of us are wired by temperament, by birth, by environmental conditioning to live more in hyperarousal. So to live more in the sympathetic energy where we're doing. Some of us are wired or conditioned to live more in this dorsal vagal energy, right? Which is more, maybe there's more of a depressive quality versus an anxious quality to the way you move around in the world. Maybe it's harder to be in your body or be connected, or maybe there's a lot of shame that kind of moves around through you. And so it's really helpful and compassionate to think about our nervous system this way, because that might help us use resources to help us navigate, right? If I have a nervous system that tends to be a little bit more dorsal vagal or a little bit more depressive, that doesn't be necessary, like down. And if I have a nervous system that tends to be more anxious and more restless, then how do I perhaps discharge that energy and bring that energy down? And then thinking about window of tolerance, right, is that some of us have a narrow window of tolerance. Like it doesn't take much to trigger us into the stress response. And some of us have a much wider window of tolerance. And some of that is based on temperament, trauma, environmental factors that happen to us, the ways in which we have the environment and people interact with us. And so the beauty of this is that there's neuroplasticity. So our brain has the ability to rewire itself. And so our nervous system has the ability to increase our capacity to sit in discomfort. So that's really hopeful, right? Is that no matter what the size of your window of tolerance is you have the capacity to increase it and build skills. So I appreciate thinking about stress in two different ways. One way is that eustress, which is kind of, normal stress that we easily can navigate, versus distress is when we start to get into that stress response. Here's the triune brain that I was talking about, right? And that, part of mindfulness or part of yoga or part of anything that we're using to resource ourselves is trying to help us have, all three parts of our brain working in harmony with each other. We want the frontal cortex online so we can access joy and abundance and confidence and that higher order thinking. We want to spend less time living in that older part of our brain, that reptilian brain, that survival brain, because in that older brain, right, when the frontal cortex are offline, that's when we are experiencing the world as dangerous. We're in a system of defense. And there's a lot of anxiety and worry and stress. So we're going to filter information from that stress response, that threat response, rather from a place of connection. So these are all the different ways stress can affect our bodies, right? It can impact our ability to concentrate. It can lead to anxiety and depression and irritability and kind of like a fogginess. It can impact our skin. It can impact our cholesterol, our blood pressure, our heart rate. It can create inflammation or tension or aches and pains or tightness if we're used to like holding a lot of tension in our shoulders. We can have a gut response. Remember that digestive system that goes offline when we experience stress. And then that can create all kinds of gastrointestinal issues. It can compromise our immune system, making us more vulnerable to illness. It can impact our reproductive system as well. So stress can play a major role in our life. So I love how Resmaa Menakem talks about the 5 anchors. So the 5 anchors are ways in which we can ground ourselves. We can come back to this. So we want to try to maybe settle our bodies with this idea that if we can settle the body, the mind follows. We can notice that observing mind. We can notice sensations, emotions without reacting to them, right? So that might sound like I'm noticing my heart racing. I'm noticing eye twitching, a stomach growling. And so if we just start to notice and name without telling the story, right? Without adding, is it good or bad? How do we accept discomfort and sit with it rather than trying to flee it? Because it will pass, right? It's like a wave. It comes, it peaks, it goes. How do I stay present and feel the ambiguity and experience the uncertainty and respond from the best part of myself? It seems like the pandemic has really been, for some of us, an invitation to ride the wave of uncertainty, to notice what arises for us in this time period. And how do I safely discharge any energy that remains, right? So that might mean moving, that might mean humming, that might be shaking things off, that might be going for a run, that might be journaling, thinking about how do we let this energy not just live inside of us. So racial stress and trauma is something we've been talking about more in the last, I would say, like 10 years or so. So this idea that Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color experience stress related to being racial beings, especially if they have a skin pigmentation that makes them be clearly viewed as Black, brown, or Asian. And it exposes them to dangers, harms, losses, challenges, injustices. So if we think about the United States, we think about the ways in which there is a racial hierarchy. When people immigrate to the United States, they quickly learn what does it mean to be in this body. Even if race is a social construction that maybe whatever country they came from, it wasn't that big a deal. They notice here that the white body, people who pass as white are given certain advantages, certain privileges, or they're just the norm, right? It's and when I say the norm, meaning like when we were to open a book or look at dolls in stores or look at images in magazines, that the standard tends to be white or lighter skin. What are the stereotypes or assumptions that are made about people who present as Asian American? What are the stereotypes and assumptions made about people who present as Black? And so thinking about what does that mean in terms of survival? What does that mean in terms of self-image? And how does that live in the body? So in this racial hierarchy, we talk about that whiteness is viewed as superior. And that goes back to the times of enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans. And we think about the ways in which whiteness was created to differentiate from Blackness, right? And that anti-Blackness is really prevalent in the United States as well as other countries. And that when we think about colorblindness, while sometimes it can be viewed as positive when we think about wanting to treat people the same, and yet we can work to treat people the same while still seeing their whole being. And that colorblindness does a lot of harm when we don't actually see and speak of the stressors that Black and brown people are experiencing moving around in the world. So when we think about, racial trauma, we think about a one-time incident of trauma. We think about repeated instances of racism. We think about racial trauma in terms of the ways we witness it and observe it, even if it doesn't happen directly to us, but we witness it in these videos that pop up, or these stories, or these articles, or it happens to a friend and we observe it happening, and the stress that leaves in the body. We think about systemic and structural racism, and we think about complex trauma, which I think of as racism plus interpersonal violence and interpersonal trauma that happens from physical abuse, neglect, verbal abuse, sexual trauma. And all of this lives in our bodies, and it can be difficult to talk about. It can be difficult to feel affirmed or validated or supported. So when I think of microaggressions, I think about those little insults, those little moments of degradation that so many Black, brown, Asian people could name, right? And so I want to just name some of them so we get a sense of what are these microaggressions, because sometimes we think of racism as overt acts of meanness and discrimination against a particular group. And yet microaggressions happen much more often, and they're based on underlying beliefs. So this idea of being an alien in one's own land, right? So who gets asked, where are they from? Who gets commented on that you speak good English? Who never really feels that they belong? I think about biracial individuals who feel like they have to choose which racial identity, or it's chosen for them based on how they look. I think about people who are, let's say, Asian American, and they're often asked, where are they from? And they're not talking about what state or what city, they're talking about what country, even if maybe they have been here for generations. So this sense of you're not really American. Who is viewed as intelligent, who is viewed as articulate, who is viewed as a credit to your own race, and what's the underlying belief there that is a surprise, that is not what is expected of this particular racial group. This idea of colorblindness and the melting pot, and that we're all one human race, and yet there are so many stories of not feeling like people are treated all the same. The assumption of criminality, not given the benefit of the doubt, the little bodily movements we make to put distance with other people, all the ways we communicate non-verbally our discomfort or our biases. When we deny individual racism, and what's the pressure that puts on the person who's experiencing the racism. The myth of meritocracy, which implies that there is a level playing field, and that everyone can succeed if they work hard enough, which puts a lot of the responsibility on the individuals. The ways in which our communication styles are critiqued or pathologized, right? Who's asked, why do you have to be so loud? And who's asked, why are you so quiet? Thinking about standard American English and how some people feel entitled or empowered to correct people's English, as if there's only one right way. The sense of feeling like a second-class citizen, ways people feel ignored, invisible, or followed around in a store, being mistaken for a service worker rather than a consumer. And what are the underlying beliefs about that? And then environmental microaggressions, the names of buildings, how people are represented or invisible in medias and shows, the overcrowding in some schools compared to others, and how often that is based on race. Who has more resources or less resources? Where are there stores? Where are highways built? All of those things, those are part of the stressors that live on in us. And they can show up biologically, right? Our stress level. It can show up in mental health issues, affecting our well-being, our ability to feel joy or to rest. It can impact our cognitive ability, our ability to process, or it could lead to us underperforming, that stereotype threat. We underperform or we perform down to what is believed about our identity. And then the ways in which that can build up rage or fatigue or hopelessness. We figure out how to comply or to code switch or how to assimilate or accommodate. And it could also lead to hypervigilance as well. I think some of us have heard about white supremacy culture, right? Which is not people, but a system, a culture. And these are some of the characteristics that Tema Okun talks about, which is perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word. There's only one right way, kind of a paternalistic, top-down, non-transparent way of operating, binary thinking, hoarding power because there's not enough, and having that scarcity mindset, fear of open conflict, so that culture of politeness, a focus on individualism rather than what would be best for the collective, a sense of I'm the only one, really valuing progress as bigger and more, focusing on the objective versus subjective experiences, focusing on data and rules, getting data or information from only one kind of place that is validated, and a right to comfort. So these are things we are taught in school. These are things that continue on in college. These are things that continue on in society. We get groomed to show up at work in these ways. What is considered professional, and how that really moves towards a white, Eurocentric way of being in the world. And so who has to assimilate or accommodate or be ready for the white gaze and the white comfort? And what kind of stress does that leave on the Black, brown, or Asian body of always needing to modulate, not bring up conversations about race or racism, really maneuver the world in terms of the white gaze and the comfort of white people, or predominantly white spaces, I should say. So that stress builds up in the body, right? So if we think about that nervous system that I was talking to you about, right? This is what I was talking about, is the central vagal system. That's our window of tolerance. That's our optimal level of arousal, right? That's when we can be socially connected with people. And then when we go into that stress response, that sympathetic response of moving into fight or flight, right? And depending on that stress, right, we might move more towards rage and anger and irritation and frustration, or we might move more towards panic, fear, anxiety, worry, or we might get so overwhelmed that our system shuts down, it collapses. And then we experience shame or hopelessness or sense of feeling trapped. There isn't much energy to do anything. There's kind of a letting go of, I just can't. So how do we notice our system moving in these ways, and what our propensities are, right? What are our patterns? Where do we tend to go in this stress response or trauma response? I love the way that they talk about these different trauma responses, right? You know, are you more of a fight response? Are you more of a flight response? Are you more freeze or fawn? Right? I think about fawn as the ways in which people learn to people please, to avoid conflict, to prioritize the needs of others, have difficulty saying no or observing their limits. And that we can have many of these responses, and they may be different in context. They may be different based on who has power in the room. It might be different parts of our life. It might depend on how many privileges we embody that allow us, right? If we have more financial resources, or we're self-employed, or we have more of a cushion, then it might be easier to move out of some of these trauma responses. Or if we've been to therapy or have done some yoga or some other healing practices to help us move out of these repetitive responses that serve us and don't serve us, right? How can we become liberated? How can we observe these stress and trauma responses without automatically reacting, right? How can my frontal cortex be online saying, like, I want to retreat, I want to make myself really small, and yet I recognize that maybe there isn't as much danger as my body is reacting to, or maybe that the risk is worth it, right? So how do we bring those frontal cortex online so that we're able to observe and then proceed mindfully with the choice that's going to best serve us in this moment? So if we think about, when we think about the ways in which BIPOC people move around in the world, right, that these different stress responses, trauma responses can be really adaptive, and they also come at a cost. So thinking about, like, what are the costs? I love how Dr. Kenneth Hardy talks about the wounds of oppression, this assaulted sense of self, right? Which is, I do so much code switching. I spend so much time defending who I'm not that I don't spend enough time figuring out who am I, right? Away from the white gaze and white supremacy culture, who am I? What are the parts of myself that didn't get to develop, or that I keep a secret, or I can only bring out in certain spaces? And how can I create more and more spaces where I can be my full self, feel affirmed? How do I let go of some of the ways I've internalized shame and silence and body shaming, colorism, and the sense that I'm less than, that my life doesn't matter, that I have to be apologetic, or I have to be okay with being disrespected, that I have to play into this culture of politeness that's really harboring a lot of nice racism. How, thinking about, like, some of the wounds of repression is losing our voice. Sometimes it's we know what we're thinking, we just don't feel we can say it. But sometimes is we've muted it so much that we don't even have a sense of what's really going on inside of us, and yet our body is screaming at us, either from a shutdown place, like being really depressed, gaining weight, and having this lethargic energy, and then our organs start to shut down, or from, like, panic attacks, right? That more hyper aroused, right? Agitation, rage, self-harming, all the ways in which we try to be perfect or overdo or overperform in order to live up to standards that are unreasonable. Other wounds of repression we've kind of mentioned is the sense of never feeling like one has a home, never feeling like one fully belongs or is like a full citizen of this country, and all the losses, tangible and untangible, and the rage. I think about, all the different ways rage can show up, and thinking about rage as healthy and justified. Like, it makes sense, right? And we have different ways of managing that rage. We can be cut off from that rage. We can channel that rage into being compliant and accommodating. We can make ourselves quieter and more invisible. We can become rebellious, trying to disrupt systems and environments. We can stuff those emotions, eating, or just like shoving it way down. We can drink our way or smoke our way to not feeling those emotions. We can try to use that rage to become the oppressor. We're tired of feeling disempowered, and so we begin to oppress others and have power over other people. We can internalize despair and depression. We can have unexpressed grief. So we see again, this fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So when we think about healing from racial stress and trauma, We have to name and validate our experiences. We have to find spaces where we can have a sense of belonging and community. We have to find our voice, cultivate that voice, figure out where we can speak out. We have to affirm our humanity, and we have to work on decreasing some of these injustices and disparities that exist in the world. I think about Shelley Harrell and the way she talks about the energy of liberation. So I want you to think about this energy of liberation that frees, that opens up, right? And just notice how my body is becoming expansive. When we think about fawn or submit or collapse, that's a body that goes in, right? That's a body that makes itself smaller, right? Even our breathing becomes more shallow. And what is an energy of liberation, right? I have to broaden my shoulders, draw them back. There's more space in my chest for me to breathe deeply, belly breathing, right? How do I take up more space in the world? In a world that doesn't want me to take up more space, or doesn't want me to take up space in a way that I show up as unapologetically Black. How do I illuminate and awaken and affirm and empower and unchain and unshackle and unburden and enliven, connect, triumph, reclaim, restore, nurture, create, improvise, relieve, uplift, rise, inspire, reveal, rescue, support, build, grow, expand, celebrate, validate? Just listen to that energy of the voice and noticing what cuts off your throat, what cuts off your voice, or what builds it up, what strengthens and discovers and unfolds and stands up and speaks truth and is revolutionary, loving and positive and joyful, dynamic, colorful, authentic, spontaneous, transcendent, spirited, passionate, right? You could come up with many more words. I love the last few years following things that emphasize Black joy and Black love, because that's really the anti-racism, right? Is more spaces for Black joy and Black love. Because if we go back to the racial hierarchy, right, if those who are viewed at the lowest end of the hierarchy, if they are able to feel more Black joy and Black love and able to take up more space, that lifts and elevates everyone. So the NAP ministry talks about how can we access pleasure and joy and liberation if we're too tired to experience it. So I want you to think about how can you access more pleasure and joy and liberation. If you notice that you tend to be exhausted, that's your nervous system telling you to slow down, to have more restorative practices in your life. So we're going to take some time to do a little yoga nidra. So yoga nidra is developed by Richard Miller, specifically related to iRest for healing post-traumatic stress disorder. So I love that it's trauma-informed, and there's definitely some guided meditations out there. If you look up yoga nidra or iRest, you can also go to my website and also capture some of that, some guided meditations that I've done. But I want to do a guided meditation with you that's iRest. And the point of yoga nidra is to create a deep meditative experience. It's really restorative. This idea that if we stay in this guided experience for a period of time, we can invoke the relaxation response. The relaxation response takes about 15 minutes to activate, right? And how many of us can be still for 15 minutes, to meditate, to be in a yoga posture for 15 minutes, to allow, and I don't mean like invigorating, I'm talking about a restful one. So I invite you to get cozy somewhere, maybe lie down, maybe do this in bed. You might notice that you fall asleep because your body needs rest. And maybe over time, if you keep doing that iRest or yoga nidra, you'll be able to stay awake and it'll penetrate some of your subconscious. Sleeping is great. We need sleep, right? And sleep isn't always restorative, right? Have you ever felt like you slept 7, 8 hours and you woke up and you still felt kind of bleh, right? And that's because we need restorative practices that allow the body to heal, the spirit to heal, and to be nourished. So in that shape that you can be in for a little bit, with your eyes open or closed, I want you to welcome the environment and sounds around you. Feeling the touch of air on your skin, the sensations where your body touches the surface that's supporting it. I want you to welcome and affirm your heartfelt mission, the feeling of life living you with purpose, meaning, and value. Welcome and affirm your intention that supports you in realizing your heartfelt mission in your daily life. Welcome and affirm your inner resource, the felt sense of well-being and of being secure and at ease in this and every moment. Bring attention to the sensations in your jaw, your mouth, ears, forehead, scalp, neck, shoulders, arms, palms, all your fingers, torso, legs, feet, all your toes, your entire body. Your body as a field of radiant sensation. Feel yourself as the observer of all the sensations that are present. Affirm to yourself, I am aware, I am at ease, I am safe and secure with myself. I know that my life matters. Sense your body breathing itself. Abdomen expanding with each inhalation. Abdomen releasing with each exhalation. With each exhalation, affirm to yourself, I am aware and at ease. I am aware and at ease. Note and welcome emotions and thoughts that are present. Welcome your experience just as it is. If it's helpful, note and experience opposites of emotions and thoughts. Notice all that are present. Noticing any actions these messages are inviting you to take in your life. Affirm to yourself, I have within me the perfect response to each moment. All of that lives within me. Welcome the ease and joy of simply being. Nothing to do, nowhere to be. Simply being. Observing the breath as it rises and falls. Welcome yourself as the observer of everything that you're experiencing. Thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations. The breath moving in and out. Joy and well-being. Noticing how everything is arising and passing away in your awareness. Welcome yourself as the spacious openness of awareness. Undeniable, indescribable, everywhere, inside, outside. Welcome this feeling of wholeness. Yourself as a unique expression of the wholeness of life, while also feeling yourself and everything interconnected and not separate. Feeling yourself as a unique expression of the wholeness of life. Maybe inviting in your supports, your resources. Inviting in your ancestors. Reminding yourself that you are not alone. That any thoughts that you are alone are stories. What are ways that you can invite these resources into your daily life? This way of knowing your inner wisdom and the ancestors who help support you in present day. Feeling yourself as a unique expression of the wholeness of life. Feeling into how much you matter. How much you are a gift to the world. As you're ready, begin to open and close your eyes several times if they were closed, welcoming your inner resource of well-being, feeling grounded and connected to yourself and the world around you, and the feeling of life living you, giving your life a sense of purpose, meaning, and value. Allowing yourself to come back to your wide awake state of mind and body, allowing the feeling of well-being to remain with you as you move back into your daily life. I appreciate you taking time to care for yourself, to practice this I rest, and to increase rest in your life so that you can experience more joy and pleasure and liberation. Wishing you well in all the ways that you move around in the world. May you feel resourced. May you feel loved. May you sprinkle kindness wherever you may travel. Take good care.